today, 1968.
The Vietnam War began 14 years ago in 1954, but between the Vietnamese to decide their government. This war is a threat to democracy. It inspires fear and enforces communist rule. Stop your protests.
My protests are a stand against an overstepping government and a stand to protect our soldiers. Do you know how the war started? During President Eisenhower's time in office, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam between the communist rule and the Democratic Republic.
Then President Truman signed the Truman Doctrine, addressing the domino effect. Once one country falls to communism, another will follow.
Our troop involvement in the war wasn't necessary. In 1960, the U.S. government sent aid, weapons, advisors, and special forces to support the war effort in Vietnam.
16,000 U.S. troops in 1963 turned into 500,000. Those troops protect our country and our democracy.
25,000 drafted by the government, ages 18 through 21. Can you imagine an 8-year-old fighting in a bloody war? But 58,000 were killed. This outrage is why the anti-war movement is needed to defend our soldiers' lives. Anti-war protesters are taking a stand against our oppressive government to defend free speech and question America's legitimacy in occupying Vietnam by burning their draft cards, dominating the media, and fighting the courts to gain national attention. By doing so, we will cause the removal of troops from Vietnam, the transformation of protest and media coverage, in addition to altering America's views on draft law.
This war is a stand against tyranny, a fight for our democracy, protecting human rights. David Miller and Benjamin Spock burned their draft cards. I served in Vietnam. Where's their respect? Their patriotism?
There is no patriotism for a war that threatens individual rights. What about their rights, their liberties? Miller and Spock expressed those freedoms by denying the draft card executed by an overstepping government. This is our stand against an oppressive government. Our stand for human rights.
North Vietnam threatens everyone's human rights. Their rights to democracy and freedom.
What about civil liberties? I'm sure the Vietnamese love their women raped and their villages pillaged. I'm sure the American men love to be sent to a war they protest.
This is a war in which...
Whose war? A political war? A legislative war? This war was not waged by the majority. Business elites and career politicians waged this war. I'm taking a stand to ensure the majority rights.
This liberal Congress, these infuriating college protests, these draft burners.
Casualties of War by Daniel Lane. The rape and murder of 5-time Mo by U.S. soldiers. What about her human rights?
Look at the bigger picture. The threat of communism, totalitarian states destroying democracy.
Look at the individual's stand, individual rights, individual freedoms, racial injustice, the threat of war.
The international stage.
The individual's stand.
International.
Individual.
International.
Individual. New York Times, February 10th, 1966. David J. Miller publicly burned his draft card in disregard to the Selective Service System's drafting law.
The United States government has violated my constitutional rights to free speech and has abused its power and privilege by amending the Selective Service System.
Other political figures in opposition to the war have encouraged what the government has dubbed a conspiracy to counsel, aid, and abet men into drafting. Dr. Benjamin Spock, a household figure named by the New York Times, has taken toll of the headlines in the Spock trials, is one such man.
It is time to show America the illegality of this war. The United States has no place in Vietnam, for there is no right for a constitutional war, for a political war, or for a war waged by the legislator. Draft resistance is irrelevant compared to America's faults.
From opposition to the war, the New Left was established in protest. Demonstrations on college campuses, underground newspapers criticizing the Vietnam War, and mass draft card protests and burnings and turn-ins on church grounds proclaimed the organization's stance.
We must end the war that has not only ended American lives, but has also made the Vietnamese suffer due to the rape and pillage from American soldiers.
Protesters held demonstrations up with 250,000 people covered by the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Harper Crimson, the Resistance, and the Tact. Draft card burners became household figures such as Benjamin Spock, and talk show hosts such as Johnny Carson, Jack Parr, Dick Cavett, and Dean Martin addressed draft card burnings and protests.
Stand up! Fight back! No more soldiers under attack! Stand up! Fight back! No more men under attack! Stand up! Fight back! No more countries under attack! Stand up! Fight back! Stand up! Fight back! Stand up! Fight back!
will now proceed in the case of U.S. v. Miller to the closing arguments made by the defense. Miller?
Yes, Judge. The day is 1966. The United States has fought for the rights and freedoms of every individual for generations. As such, my client, David J. Miller, has the right to oppose a war without being subject to persecution by the United States government. This war is unconstitutional.
Watch your words. This case is not on the legality of the war.
Yes, Your Honor. Miller has only taken a stand against a war in opposition to his beliefs and addressed the government's problems. He's only guilty of expressing his freedom of speech and protest.
We will now proceed to the closing arguments made by the prosecution.
David J. Miller should be indicted on selective service system law under violation of Section 12B3 of the Universal Military Service and Training Act, as amended in 1965. By knowingly mutilating his draft card, Miller has failed to possess his draft card in violation of law. Congress is constitutionally empowered to raise and support an army. Miller is in violation of such power.
After hearing the arguments and studying the case, I have made my decision on the legitimacy of the amendment to the elective service system in 1965. The amendment has strengthened a valid obligation of existing law regarding military drafting and is valid expression of Congress's constitutional power to raise and support an army, although not overwhelmingly necessary for continued function of the selective service system. On the draft obligation of David J. Miller, I find the defendant guilty of mutilation and non-possession of his draft card in case of needed backup for government records. Citizens have a right to protest, except in the case of destruction of official documents or certificates.
I served in Vietnam. I've heard the protesters on college campuses, street corners, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and news shows. The new left is right. A political war is a wrong war. America sees that now. Nixon, withdraw our troops. The war ends today, 1972.
Burn your cards. The war is worse than the government's fines. A.J. Must, Dwight McDonald, David Gilliger, Bayard Rustin, David J. Miller, Benjamin Spock. Withdrawal of troops is the only way to change our government for the better.
We elected you. Withdraw our troops. Before I started to protest, 28% of Americans opposed the war. We have moved that margin to 55 in opposition and 31 in favor. President Nixon ended the war to coincide with popular opinion in 1973 with a ceasefire between North and South Vietnam and the withdrawal of American troops.
My professors and many politicians now believe that the U.S. will never use the selective service system's drafting capability due to the protest and demonstrations that brought major resentment, judicial review, and scrutiny to the United States government.
Protests changed. It was no longer about exercising free speech to capture the government's attention.
Draft card burners took a stand to blatantly defy law to force the government to incorporate their ideals in law, whether in the legislature or the judiciary.
Journalists began to participate in protests to capture the anger of social groups and hear from the citizens directly.
Journalists developed not into a research job, but into interaction with citizens and the understanding of and writing of a group's beliefs or government policy.
By burning draft cards, overwhelming the media, and fighting the government in federal cases, anti-war protesters defended their individual rights and freedoms of free speech and protest, while calling attention to the legality of the Vietnam War.
The anti-war movement forced President Nixon to withdraw the troops from Vietnam, transformed the nature of demonstrations and the media coverage, and forever changed America's views on military drafting.